Hello, welcome. I'm Martina Devlin, and here at the Little Museum of Dublin, I'm about to be in conversation with broadcaster Andrea Catherwood, historian Diarmaid Ferriter, political commentator Alex Kane, and politician Ian Marshall. It ties in with an exhibition at the museum in conjunction with the National Museums Northern Ireland called "You Say You Love Me, but You Don't Even Know Me." After a century of misunderstandings between the two parts of the island, I'll be asking our panellists, what's caused the disconnect and can it be overcome? So, Diarmaid Ferriter is Professor of Modern History at University College Dublin and one of Ireland's best known historians with a gift for making history accessible. His books include The Border and Judging Dev, a reassessment of the life and legacy of Eamon de Valera. His latest book is Between Two Hells, the Irish Civil War. BBC broadcaster Andrea Catherwood presents regularly on Radio 4, including Woman's Hour and The Media Show. She's also a documentary maker, and recent documentaries include The Prospects for a United Ireland, post-Brexit, and A Sea Between Us, an exploration of unionism and loyalism in Northern Ireland a century on. Ian Marshall is Business Development Manager at the Institute for Global Food Security in Queen's University, Belfast, and he also manages the family farm in partnership with his son. A former president of the Ulster Farmers Union, he made history when he became the first ever Ulster Unionist elected to Seanad Éireann. He served for 2 years. He's running as Ulster Unionist Party candidate in West Tyrone in the forthcoming Stormont elections. And Alex Kane is a former Director of Communications for the Ulster Unionist Party and was based at the Northern Ireland Assembly for 12 years. He's a freelance columnist and commentator, contributing to a number of newspapers and a range of political programmes on the BBC, ITV and RTE. Welcome, everyone. So, a question for each of you, and I will start with you, Ian. What will the United Kingdom look like in 20 years' time?
Goodness, that's a light one just to get us started. Certainly, it will probably look, very different to how it looks now. The one thing that we have at the moment across the UK is certainly that it's multicultural. It's very diverse. It's very dynamic. I actually think that with all the pandemonium around Brexit, I think we will get through this period. I think there will be a good relationship again with European neighbours. I think there'll be a good relationship with Ireland, with the island of Ireland. And I think I'm positive, I'm glass half full in this, because I think that it's going to look fundamentally different, because we're facing a multitude of challenges now, whether it's climate change, whether it's energy, whether it's geopolitical threats. But fundamentally, I think that it will be a good place for us to live, work, and be.
But will it be the same format that it is now?
I actually think it will in 20 years. And I think that because I take my soundings from lots of different places. And I think there's a conversation is beginning about constitutional change. But I think when we look at all the polling, all the statistics across the board, there hasn't been a significant movement. I think that there's still a roadmap that people need to draw out what a constitutional change would look like. I think that there is a consensus across the UK. I think despite a very vocal, possibly English nationalist voice of people who say, well, if I'm born in Scotland, I'm Scotch and I'm British. If I'm born in England, I'm English and British. If I'm born in Wales, I'm Welsh and British. If I'm born in Northern Ireland, I'm Irish and British. And I think that dynamism where we could be multicultural and not defined very closely by where we reside, I think the constitutional position will be unchanged, and I think that's because we still have a lot to learn about each other, a lot to understand about each other, and a lot to have conversations about.
Andrea, would you go along with that, or do you see change coming?
I just don't know, Martina. I really don't know. I think there'll be a border poll in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. So there's likely to be 2 referendum in the next 20 years in the United Kingdom. But which way either or both of those go, I don't know. And I think it's really, I think that it is extremely close. And I think that one thing that, it is worth really highlighting is that in Northern Ireland, the decision about the future of the country, if there is a border poll, which I think there will be, it will be decided by people who don't really identify as unionist or nationalist. The most recent polling about the elections that Ian's going to be involved in May, show that there's 22% of people in Northern Ireland who vote for either the Alliance or the Green Party. They're not identifying with the traditional politics that we assume in Northern Ireland, the kind of the us and them politics. No, we don't know how they will vote in a border poll, but what we can say is that they probably are going to be swayed by things other than where their granny was from. They're actually going to be looking at the NHS, they're going to be looking at the economy, they're going to be looking at whether they want to become part of the EU again, for example. And so, there's all to play for, but the traditional idea that unionists just had to kind of say, well, look, obviously, we want to be part of the United Kingdom. That's not going to be enough anymore. If unionists want to keep Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, they need to sell the union to that middle ground, to people who don't necessarily just wake up in the morning and want to be part of Britain, to people who are open-minded and who may decide they want to stay in the United Kingdom, but who are also open to a prospect that for a lot of people looks quite appealing, of rejoining the EU, which of course, remember, Northern Ireland didn't want to leave in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Alex, is a good enough job being done of selling the union?
No, I don't think it is. And I think if we're talking about the United Kingdom, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, I think we still don't know what that means. We don't know what it is to be a citizen of the United Kingdom. Scottish people have an identity, Welsh people have an identity, English nationalism here in Northern Ireland with a number of competing identities. And I think that's the problem. If we had to ask for someone to speak for the United Kingdom right now, I'm not sure who that person would be. I'm not sure who in the United Kingdom at any political level, even academic or intellectual level, has the credibility to stand up to them. And I remember in my lifetime, I've seen one person try and do it twice, and that was David Cameron at the time of the Scottish referendum, and his whole campaign in the Scottish referendum trying to say to the Scots people, stay as part of the United Kingdom, we're much better. He didn't set out any values of the United Kingdom. He didn't set out anything which binds us together as the United Kingdom. He basically told the Scottish people, if you vote for independence, you're going out into the wilderness by yourself. It was thanks to Gordon Brown who made the case to keep Scotland within the United Kingdom. And then you go to a few years down the line, you go to the EU referendum, where Cameron made exactly the same mistake. Instead of setting out a vision of the United Kingdom within the European Union, which was going to be a difficult sell anyway, at least he could say, look, all of us benefit. This is why we benefit. This is why it's important we stay in this. He left the argument, the definition of the United Kingdom, the definition of UK sovereignty, he left it in the hands of a bunch of serial lunatics, mostly from the hardline right wing, from people like Nigel Farage and so on. And the vision, the image they present of the United Kingdom at that point, I don't recognize. I've never recognized it. I still don't recognize it. So, I mean, if your original question, Martina, about will the Union survive, will the United Kingdom survive, in 20 years, not unless somehow we find a way of addressing all those issues, because it's still competing nationalisms. It's still warring factions. I mean, we used to talk about Northern Ireland, just in the us and them thing. One of the most disturbing things I think I've seen in my political lifetime is the us and them politics, which is now dominating the agenda of UK politics. Everywhere you go, and we've seen it in America as well. There used to be a time when you would listen to the other side. You would listen to an argument. You might even allow yourself to be converted or influenced to have some sympathy for. Now we seem, and I say it, I mean, I grew up with it in Northern Ireland, Orange and Green. I was always a liberal, moderate unionist, someone who backed partition and so on. And from about the age of 18 was described as a Lundy. So I've got used to being dismissed. But it does worry me that right across the United Kingdom, I see anyone, if you take a stand, you must take that stand, because in not taking that stand, you are somehow betraying, you're treacherous to your tribe. And that, until we get rid of that, until we can get back to a debate about what it means to be a citizen of the United Kingdom, I think we're in a very, very difficult situation.
Well, Diarmaid, you're an historian. One thing you could say from your study of history is that change happens. I mean, change is inevitable. It's part of the human condition.
It is unconscious as well. And looking back to the original Act of Union, that one of the justifications for it that was offered by the British Prime Minister at the time was that it would ensure Ireland would remain an integral part of the imperial hinterland. And the question became, well, what happens when it becomes, or part of it becomes, or most of it becomes an unhappy part of the imperial heartland? And that's still relevant today. I mean, I think the points about Scottish nationalism are crucial. Does that continue to develop momentum, or does it become stalled, or does it become diluted in some way? Will it be the case that the failures of politics that Alex has quite rightly articulated there will embolden the Scottish nationalist cause and will make things more complicated for Northern Ireland? I remember a very striking finding during the worst of the Brexit fallout and the heated recriminations was that 59% of the British Conservative Party expressed a preference for abandoning Northern Ireland if it came to a choice between Northern Ireland and Brexit. And, you know, the failures of political leadership, I think the vision question is crucial. I mean, I'm thinking even of senior Tories who are expressing disgust with Boris Johnson. Take John Major, for example, whatever your views of John Major. He did attempt in the 1990s to try and shore up the idea of a Tory vision, a one nation vision. He invoked George Orwell and so on. And, you know, there was a mystic nostalgia and romanticization in part of that, but it was an attempt to try and articulate an idea of where we might be going or what we can draw on from our past. Clearly, those currently leading the Brexit project and indeed leading the British Conservative Party don't have that depth. They don't have that serious engagement with the very idea of politics. I think that was summed up very well by David Putnam, actually, when he made his valedictory address to the House of Lords at the end of last year. And yes, he did speak about the profound British ignorance that he detected about Ireland, but he also said that that was part of a wider malaise about the debasement of politics and political ideas and vision. And that's going to remain very relevant. And when you think of the pillars, or some of the pillars, traditional pillars of the UK, including the monarchy, there's going to be big change there. I mean, Queen Elizabeth II, for all her longevity, she's not going to be there in 20 years. And so, you know, even at that level of transition and change, a lot of the touchstones that you might associate with the union or identifying with the union or the pillars of the union are going to come under increasing strain. So I think it's going to be fraught and it's going to be fractured. And I certainly wouldn't put any bets on its survival.
So your crystal ball says probably not.
Well, a historian is probably the last person to be asking to predict the future. But again, you know, going on I suppose, fault lines, and we tend to do that a lot as historians. We identify fault lines and when they emerge and what they can become. You know, and if you apply that analysis, I suppose, to the future, even though it's dangerous, you wouldn't be optimistic.
Okay, you're saying fault lines. So, Andrea, I'm going to bring you in here because you're living in London, and Diarmaid just said something about, you know, to the effect that a lack of understanding. You must see that all around you in Britain, people's attitudes to Northern Ireland, or, you know, ignorance, really.
Apathy, real, you know, proper deep apathy. I mean, people in England really don't care. It's almost impossible to explain to Irish people how little they care. And I think that, you know, I mean, even the very fact that we are here today doing this on Valentine's Day, you know, there is not, I can absolutely guarantee, without doing any research, that there isn't a parallel going on in a lovely museum in Kensington right now, where they are deeply angsting over why they don't understand unionism and nationalism in Northern Ireland. They couldn't give a shit, you know? I mean, that's something that is just deeply embedded in Irish and in British culture, that I think I think the other thing that's really important to remember is that there are quite a few people in England who have relationships with Ireland because they've got family there. But the majority of them, of course, have family in the south of Ireland because that's just the demographics. So, you know, if you meet somebody in England and they've got an Irish relations in Ireland, they're more likely to have them in the 26 counties than, you know, than in the north, just, you know. So the way they see Ireland, and that's why I think an awful lot of people who, if they think anything about Northern Ireland, they think that it should decide for itself. You know, a lot of English people thought, particularly before the last referendum, last Scottish referendum, that they actually did want Scotland to remain part of Britain. You know, they see it as an intrinsic, I mean, it's just, you know, it's a single land mass, you know. I don't think that people, if they care at all, if they think about it at all, or if they're asked about it, really think that they should have any say in what happens in Northern Ireland, you know? And so I think that there is a massive disconnect. And, you know, British politics and British media, you know, I think, you know, the day that the DUP decided that they'd quite like to collapse Stormont, not one front page in the United Kingdom covered it, not one headline. And that's quite amazing because this, you know, Northern Ireland is in the United Kingdom. So this is a devolved government in this country. And yet it didn't make the front page of any national newspaper. The coverage is just not there. There isn't the interest. And I don't know, I can't see how that would change.
Didn't there, a lot of people were Googling the DUP when they were propping up Theresa May's government after that disastrous general election she had, and they were wondering exactly who the hell are these? Yeah. Because they're propping up the British government. But when Andrea was talking there, I was reminded of a line from 1924 from Lord Salisbury, who was a senior Tory, and he said baldly, "The average English voter has little interest in and even less understanding of Ireland." 97 years ago.
Yeah.
So we used to joke that they thought that the DUP was a parcel delivery service after when Theresa May needed them desperately to prop up her government.
But there is there's more media interest, I think, in the rise of Sinn Fein, and what that might mean and what it represents. I would detect a lot more media interest in Britain in that side of the story.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because part of it, of course, has to do with the questions it raises about a possible border poll, but it's also about the trajectory. You know, what has this story been about? You know, these were terrorists for so long, and that was very much a part of the media coverage, obviously, of what was happening in Ireland. And, you know, this is now a 30-year story, you know, the trajectory and the peace process, and the prospect of them as an all-island party leading government in both parts of the island is, I suppose, a story that would spark more interest.
Yeah.
Martina, so just going to say, dropping in on what both Andrea and Diarmaid had said there, in terms, I mean, certainly going back to the 2017 pact between the Conservatives and the DUP, I mean, I almost got enough to do an extension to the House from journalists across the United Kingdom and America asking me to explain to them what the DUP was all about, who they were. And that's important because from 2010, when the DUP wiped the Ulster Unionists out of Westminster, the DUP was the main unionist voice in Westminster, and yet they seem to know nothing. Nobody knew. I even had MPs who've been told from press offices to talk to people like me to explain the DUP. And you go back a few years earlier to when David Trimble was trying to sell the Good Friday Agreement, and go back further than that to the 1985, the Anglo-Irish Agreement. I remember Jim Molyneux, who was leader of the Ulster Unionist Party at that time, telling me after that agreement was signed that there would be a rebellion. Thatcher would face a rebellion like no British Prime Minister had faced in 2 generations because the Ulster Unionist Party had friends across the House. I think my count is somewhere around 30 people rebelled, and that's the problem. When the DUP did their deal with the Conservatives, they said the ERG is on our side. They understand us. They're unionists. They'll back us. The ERG had no idea who most of the DUP were, or what actually mattered to them. And that has been, it just touches, but I think Dermot mentioned it there about Sinn Fein have made the story, they've made the political noise simply because unionism, and Ian will know this, unionism has been singularly terrible at explaining itself, and giving it its vision, telling people what it is. So when we need someone, when union, and I speak as an unashamed, unapologetic, unembarrassed unionist, if the moment comes in the border poll, which I think Andrea's right, it will come. I have no idea who from England, who from national politics will come and take our side, because I don't think anybody knows about us, and I don't think most of them care anyway. Even the ones who might know about us, I don't think they care about us.
Okay, could I just follow on? Yeah, could I just follow on that conversation? Because what I think is quite interesting, the dynamic that maybe we're missing here is that you're exactly right, Andrea. No one in London is remotely concerned about Northern Ireland, who the players are, what the politics are. But that being said, are those people in London actually concerned about Falmouth? Are they concerned about Gateshead? Are they concerned about much outside London? And when I'm in London,
just a second, but Falmouth and Gateshead aren't planning to secede, or there isn't talk of them seceding.
No, but they're parts of the United Kingdom outside London. So that's about they're parts of the
difference,
UK
Ian, is that they can vote Conservative or Labour. They do have a vote, and Northern Ireland, they don't have a vote that anybody in Westminster in the main parties is interested in. So they might not really care about Falmouth, but they have to care a little bit because they want the votes from that place.
Yeah, but this notion that Northern Ireland is actually just a completely uninteresting place, that's fine. But actually, when you're in London and you read the English tabloid press, Ireland doesn't feature. In fact, when the Taoiseach went on to the Andrew Marr show, they struggled to say his name. So this notion that London are concerned about Ireland in its entirety, we must bear that in mind. And what you do see, what I saw from my time in Dublin, was that there was nearly a fixation in the Dublin press about what's happening in the UK. And it features right through the thread of British reporting, goes right through the Irish press, but it's not reciprocated in London. And whether that's small island and as a neighbour of a large island, I'm not sure. But I think Alex is completely correct. Unionism has been horrendous in how they've sold themselves and portrayed themselves. And remember, most people view unionism through the lens of a handful of egotistical DUP MPs who've been in London for the last goodness knows how long. And the reality is, I remember when Andrew Trimble, the rugby player, was on the Claire Byrne show. And the next morning, my phone went crazy. People were ringing me saying, oh, goodness, Ian, isn't Andrew Trimble a breath of fresh air? What a lovely guy. He's a good guy. He's a bit of fun, a bit of humour, And I said, but hold on, guys. My life, my family, the people I work with, the people I'm friendly with, are all Andrew Trimble's. But the perception of unionism was through this lens of a few high-profile Democratic Unionist Party politicians. And that's the lens that people view us through. So this notion that we're regressive and backward, actually, it's nothing's farther from the truth. And, and it's funny because the Harry Enfield Ulsterman character is quite funny because therein lies our problem. And as regards communication, the unionism has been horrendous because unionism, remember, in my opinion, has been built on, at 1921 at Partition, the Republic was built on expansion, globalization, growth, independence, and all of those things. The North was actually focused on protecting what we have and holding on to what we have. And I think that kind of has manifested itself right through as we track the politics of that.
One of the ironies.
Sorry, just one second. Does your heart not sink as a unionist when you hear what Andrea has to say about the British media paying no attention whatsoever? I mean, because how can you maintain a union where you're not really wanted, where people are indifferent, apathetic to you?
My heart doesn't sink at all, and I'll tell you why, because that phenomenon is not unique to the UK. When I looked at the politics in Dublin, and Dublin-centric people are not concerned remotely about what's happening in Donegal. It doesn't feature. They're not interested. They're disinterested. And this phenomenon that Northern Ireland is something, a place apart. I'm not convinced, because I still get a lot of affection and a lot of connection in the UK. And certainly, I think as it's played out through our politics, it certainly doesn't help us. It doesn't help us endear ourselves to people. But I'm not convinced there's this big fracturing of that relationship. I think Andrea used the word apathy, and I think apathy defines where we are. People are just quite tired of it. There's a generation of people who are growing up 23 years on from the Good Friday Agreement who said, "Come on, guys, just get on with it. Please, just get on with it."
Diarmaid, I cut across you there.
Yeah, no, I'm very interested in, I suppose, the failures of communication within modern unionism. And it's been said for a long time now that a traditional type of unionism is not going to save the union. One of the ironies, perhaps, is that if you go right back to the original Home Rule crisis of 1912 to 1914, the unionist campaign to resist Home Rule was actually remarkably modern. It was a modern media campaign. It was about marketing. It was about the use of film. It was about mobilization. It was about attempting to reach a British audience. And in some respects, it was successful. And there is that, historic achievements that they had around mobilizing for their cause and communicating that message. So there might be lessons in history there. But there was also, at the same time as that campaign, there was always a distrust of London. And I mean, when I think of some of the original architects of modern unionism, people like Ernest Hamilton. I mean, we're familiar, obviously, with the Edward Carsons and the James Craig, but take Ernest Hamilton, who was an Tyrone MP. He wrote the book called The Soul of Ulster, which in many respects is a work of propaganda. But part of the point he was making is that we need to see ourselves as an independent Ulster people. And it was Ulster, and the reason we need to see ourselves as an independent Ulster people is because we certainly can't trust Dublin, but we can't trust London either.
But there have been attempts to promote a Northern Irish identity. I mean, how successful have they been, Andrea?
I think that there are a lot of people in Northern Ireland, anyone in Northern Ireland under 30 doesn't remember the Troubles. We talk a lot these days about lived experience. People under 30, now, I'm not saying that they haven't had a kind of intergenerational trauma, and some people have been very badly affected through that, but actually they don't remember the Troubles, thankfully. And for a lot of people, when they think of Northern Ireland, the place that they grow up, the place that they live, they might think of bodyboarding in Portrush or going out in the Cathedral Quarter. A lot of people really aren't defined by, particularly under 30s, aren't really defined by, they don't go to church. A lot more people come from mixed heritage backgrounds than I think there is a perception, and so for those people, yes, there is an identity. It's for 100 years, Northern Ireland has existed. My grandparents, I don't think, I come from a very mixed background, but neither the nationalists or the unionists, were ever really, I think, that comfortable with the border. The unionists because they were afraid it was going to go, and the nationalists because they wanted to get rid of it. But I think that the younger people are they've grown up with Northern Ireland. They might, they look at Northern Ireland and they think of Rory McIlroy and Jamie Dornan and Game of Thrones, and there is a whole world out there that's not connected to politics. And when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, it was impossible to avoid the Troubles. They were absolutely ingrained in our daily life, more so probably than we even realized at the time. But now, although in the last 20 years, of course, if you're interested in politics, of course, it's all going on, and we've had the flag protests and we've had Stormont collapsing and all of that. But it's actually very possible to live there and to avoid all that and put it to one side these days, unless you live in a few very deprived areas. But for a vast majority of people, they are able to live a much more open lifestyle. Do people really consider themselves Northern Irish? Yeah, I think so, because I think one of the things that's quite difficult is, the very fact you have to say, oh, you're able to consider yourself British or you're able to consider yourself Irish. It's a bit weird, because if you live in Dublin, you're just Irish. And if you live in England, you're just English. You don't have to say, I consider myself to be English and British. You just are. And, you know, if you live in Northern Ireland, you're constantly kind of wrestling with this culture and trying to justify it and saying, like, you know, I consider myself to be Irish, but what about just being Irish, you know?
Maybe it was a solution. Alex, what do you think? Is a halfway house between an Irish and a British identity possible?
I'm not sure. One thing is that my eldest is 23 now, and has been at university for the past few years. And I used to say to her about, you know, she did politics A levels. She grew up in a political household, so she's interested in politics. And I was talking to her about, you know, the changes, you know, to saying how my life, how it contrasted to what her life was, because she was talking about going to some club in West Belfast. And I remember laughing and said, you know, when I was your age, I couldn't have gone. Well, I wouldn't have been allowed to go to West Belfast when I got involved in politics when the Troubles were still on. I would have been advised not to go to West Belfast. So I say it's a wonderful thing that you can go. I was just talking. I said, how do you, you know, the relationships you built up? Obviously, you don't say, are you Catholic, are you Protestant, or anything like that. Do you talk politics? I said, of course we do, Dad. We talked about Trump and Putin and, you know, the EU and the referendum and so on. I said, what about local politics? And she looked at me sheepishly. I said, we don't talk about it. And I said, why? And she said, we don't want to embarrass each other. We don't want to, you know, cause trouble. And that's worrying. Look, I just say that in one sense it's a good thing, but it's also slightly worrying that children that age, that gap, let's say from the 18 maybe through to early 30s, choose not to talk about local politics because they know it still resonates. And I mean, Megan would not have known the Troubles. That's my eldest. She wouldn't have known the Troubles, although she knows the consequences of the Troubles, because her first vote was for the 2017 Assembly election, an Assembly which didn't meet for the next 3 years and which has just collapsed again. But in terms, you know, when Andrea talked there about the you know, the Northern Irish identity, can there be such a thing as a Northern Irish identity? It would have needed time to build up. It would have needed, you'd need to go back maybe 20 years to start the build, to start that roll towards it. Because the problem is that the border poll question, it dominates the agenda now, it dominates all the agendas. It's always a head count in Northern Ireland, but I think it's even more of a head count now. And the problem is, at some point, I reckon it'll be in the next 10 to 15 years, maybe less than that. At some point, there will be a border poll. People will have to pick a side at that point, because it won't be Ireland, United Kingdom. It won't be United Ireland, Northern Ireland, United Kingdom, or somewhere in the middle, this Northern Irish identity. It will be a cold, brutal choice between two constitutional alternatives. And with that hovering over everything, I think it's going to make it almost impossible. I think that moment of building, I voted for the Good Friday Agreement with a number of reservations, but I voted for it. And those of you in the panel who know me well will know I'm not a person who really does emotion and things like that. But I voted for it because it was a moment which hadn't existed in my lifetime. I wanted my children to have choices which were never available to me. I don't see that. I just think the fact that the young generation outside their own comfort zone will not talk politics, and the fact that they all know that at some point they will have to make that choice, it makes it impossible to build this new, I don't mean to demean it by calling it sort of cozy, consensual, we can all get all together identity. I just think that moment is gone.
Well, I suppose what you're saying is ambiguity will evaporate when a border poll is called. People will have to choose, will have to make a decision on what their identity is.
And whether they want to or not, because it'll be a Secretary of State. It's very ambiguously worded in the Belfast Agreement, the terms and conditions under which a border poll will be called, but it will be called. And at that moment, Martina, they have to they either don't vote or they make a choice. And it's very difficult to build the cooperation and the unity and the coming together, which I always hope to see in Northern Ireland. Right away, it's why I backed power sharing in 1974. And it saddens me, it really does. It really does sadden me to say it, but I will accept whatever the result of the border poll is and make the best of whatever the outcomes are. But the notion that there will be a Northern Ireland, which is a Northern Ireland, which is free from that shackles of constantly having to take the challenges of identity and so on, that's gone. I
mean, those ambiguities have always been a part of dealing with Northern Ireland. I mean, even going back to the original Boundary Commission, you know, in a part of the Anglo-Irish Treaty to kind of kick the border question down the road, and the wording and the phrasing in that part of the treaty was deliberately ambiguous. And people could interpret it in ways that suited them, you know, because you have reference there to in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, but there's no specifics as to how you establish the wishes of the inhabitants. And in relation to a border poll, and I agree, one is likely, you know, is it going to increase this insistence that it has to be something more than 50+1? Because people will bring you back, of course, to the ancient question, you know, and it was articulated actually by a British Liberal MP, a Liberal Unionist, Harry Lawson, in 1912 at the beginning of this debate about partition. And he said, how are you in this democratic age, in this democratic country, going to force 1 million men, as he put it, into a country they don't want to be part of? And we're going to have an updated version of that question unless there is an agreement, you know, to have something different than that crude.
Yet how else do you do it?
That's the huge challenge, you know. I mean, obviously there have been suggestions that you need to put a different figure on it, and that creates its own problem. Supposing you say, oh well, it has to be 2/3, and then you would have an insistence that, well, how is that democratic? You know, so it's a really, really tricky one.
How polarizing has partition been, Diarmaid, for relationships on this island? We've been talking about Britain and Ireland in the north, but what about the two parts of the island?
Well, you know, it predates partition, you know, that sense of the other. Like Tim Healy, for example, who was a well-known nationalist MP in the 1880s, and he represented Wexford. He was asked at one stage to stand for election in Monaghan. And he said he would go to the remote north to raise the flag for the remote north, right, to Monaghan. And it's just a reminder of that sense that's so long-standing and has endured for so long, of the remote or the other. You know, that kind of mental partition, I would argue, predated the actual physical partition of the island. And it's not just about the 6 counties that constitute Northern Ireland, it's about Ulster. Yeah. There are many in Donegal. I think Ian alluded to that. There are many in Donegal who feel that they're on the outer edge. You know, there's a very revealing plea from a Derry IRA man in the early 1920s who was also active in Donegal, and he said, you will be accused of abandoning your Highlanders, you know, if you allow this partition to become bedded down. And even the use of that phrase, the Highlanders, you know, they were always the Highlanders, you know, and they felt neither wanted them. And they still feel, many in Donegal would still feel that, you know, and there are practical manifestations of what they would see as terrible neglect in relation to infrastructure and connectivity and that. So that has always been a factor. There's another form, I suppose, of partitionist thinking. Historians would often say, slightly cynically, I suppose, that after the Boundary Commission in 1925, many didn't bother taking a look over the border until the late 1960s. You know, there was that kind of frozen in time quality and a sense of not just disconnect, but that is still a remote place that we cannot connect with emotionally. We might, in theory, there's actually been quite a consistency since the 1970s when people are asked the direct question, would you like to see a united Ireland? Roughly 2/3 of people in the Republic would say yes, but it's quite abstract and theoretical, I think, you know, and it connects back to the last question about creating the conditions, you know, for a proper dialogue around that. You can't do that, you know, obviously without people making a serious commitment to talking to each other and trying to create certain conditions. But, you know, often mischievously now posters will ask, well, you're in favour of United Ireland, but if you had to pay more tax, would you still be in favour of United Ireland? And, you know, how will the figures shift, you know, when you start to bring in economic questions? And even on the economics of it, you know, there will be divided opinion on the part of economists, you know, when you get into rows about the extent of the British Chequers subvention. And
we don't know a lot of those figures, do we? Because we need governments to reveal them, and governments aren't revealing them. But Ian, you've worked on both parts of the island. You were a senator in Shanadaran. Was it a positive experience?
Yeah, certainly, Martina, that was a positive experience. I suppose the interesting thing was the level of misunderstanding and a lack of understanding north and south is you couldn't honestly believe it until you travel between Belfast and Dublin on a regular basis and deal with political conversations on both sides. And I suppose what's interesting, just in the conversation that Diarmaid has made, the points he's made about partition, The thing that I think is really, really important that we all should be picking up in the events of the last few months, the Michael D. Higgins trip to Armagh that wasn't, or that didn't come about, I think what that flagged up to me is something that's really, really important in this conversation, because as Northern Unionists, as Northern Protestant Unionists, I don't think we've ever really got the deep sense of hurt in nationalist and Republican communities about the partitioning of an island. I don't think we've really ever truly understood that. And that's something that I picked up when I was in Dublin, how deep that sense of betrayal and fracturing of an island was. But the flip side of that is that there's a massive cohort of people in the Republic who just never comprehend the deep sense of pride and feeling Northern Unionists have to Northern Ireland and to Great Britain, to the United Kingdom. And they can't understand that deep sense of connection. And I think that we've got to try and reconcile that and understand the other perspective on this. But you know, when you work in Leinster, and the interesting thing is, and Diarmaid's point is completely correct. I went to there, I had to Google where Leinster House was, because I didn't know where Leinster House was in Dublin. But that's not unique. And that's not surprising, because most of my friends couldn't tell you. In fact, I would suggest if you took a poll in Belfast this evening for Southern politicians, you get the Taoiseach, you get the Taoiseach, you might get one or two other ministers. You'll certainly not get a long list of TDs and senators or elected representatives. So there is a huge disconnect and a lack of understanding, because effectively we function as separate entities as it is. And the media, when I lifted the papers in the morning in Dublin and I read the headlines, and I went to Queen's, I went to Belfast the same day, and I opened the papers in Belfast, there was massive chunks of that just disconnected completely, not related to each other.
And there's an idea in unionism, and also maybe in British nationalism, that something shared is something lost. Could it not be something gained?
Well, the interesting thing is that when you talk about the Scottish question and the Scottish independence is if Scottish independence happens, those people remain to be Scottish. If Northern Ireland goes into United Ireland, half of the people feel that they're no longer British. So you've got a fundamental problem. When we had the unification of Germany, effectively everybody was German before and everyone was German afterwards. So we've got a unique set of circumstances here. And I think that message about, and look, it's quite interesting, because a lot of the conversation revolves around ideology. I work in a university and everything must be based on evidence and fact. And I think there's a distinct lack of evidence and fact and modelling of what anyone's talking about. I think that the reality is there's a massive fear of unknown, there's a massive fear of change, and there's no question that I don't think that Northern Unionism feels that it would be accommodated. And you know, when we looked at the last piece of polling data that came out, I think it was a Red C poll, where 62% of people when questioned said they wanted unity. But when the further questions were asked about anthems, flags, unionists having defined seats, or even rejoining of the Commonwealth, it was very clear in those questions that certainly we're still a long way off reconciling difference and being truly inclusive. And I did listen to a Dublin TD say one time that he would welcome unionists into New Ireland. Well, I'm at home this evening. If I come home and my wife welcomes me to my own house, as I'm sure we would have words. So, you know, I think we still have to work on this conversation. I think it's been sometimes oversimplified, and I think that part of the understanding is to learn from Brexit, because a complex question cannot be answered by a few simple polls, and certainly the referendum will happen, I've no doubt about that. But the question I always ask people about the referendum is that once someone can tell me what we will do with the losing group the next day after the referendum, then possibly we're getting somewhere. But at the moment, no one can tell me what we do with the losing side the day after the referendum.
Well, Andrea, I hate to put you on the spot, but any ideas on that one?
It's a very
maybe not to think of it as a losing side for starters, because that already makes it problematic.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to see how that wouldn't be the case. I mean, that is the problem, because you've got, if we think about this, I'm going back to this group, the others, this demographic that's growing in Northern Ireland that doesn't identify closely as nationalist or unionist. They are the people who are actually going to end up deciding a border poll, because I know that we've talked about this being a head count. It's terribly reductive, but on the other hand, that's what happens in a referendum, and we're going to find that the nationalists, if you just add up the Sinn Fein and the SDLP vote, and then you look at the unionists, both the DUP and the UUP, they kind of balance out. And then you've got this other in the middle who are going to make their decisions, and that's what's going to flip a border poll if it turns out to be 50+1. And I can't see that it could be anything else, particularly as in the UK, they've already had a referendum in Scotland where that was the situation. So I really can't imagine a situation where, say, 60% of people in Northern Ireland vote to rejoin the island of Ireland as one country, and they're denied that because it's a 66%. I can't imagine that being the case. I think that a lot of people in Northern Ireland are not able to gain the right information about what a new Ireland would really look like yet. And part of it is because, the DUP, when I used to talk to them, would just refuse to talk about a border poll or the potential reunification of Ireland. Now they will talk about it, but what they'll say, and it's quite clever because it's quite short, and they just say, look, the South doesn't want us, actually. They don't really want us. And also, the South can't afford us. So it's easy. They don't want us, can't afford us, and that's it. I understand, I've spoken to Doug Beattie about this, Ian, and, the UUP, I kind of get it, that why should the Ulster Unionists sort of set out a roadmap of what they think it might look like when it's not something they want, And the Alliance and the Green Party are not talking about this. So the people who are naturally voting for the Alliance and the Green Party and who would like to do other things than talk about the constitutional situation are the very people who are going to end up deciding the constitutional future of Ireland. And yet they are the people whose party, whose tribe, if you like, isn't discussing this yet and isn't telling them whether or not the one set of economists or another set of economists, they believe that they're right, or what could happen to an all-Ireland health service, or any of the other questions, the practical questions that people, particularly young people who are growing up in Northern Ireland, who want to make it their home and who are thinking about the next 20, 30 years and what it's going to be like for their kids. These are all the practical questions that people will vote on. And yet, at the moment anyway, they're not getting any answers from the people who they consider who are their elected representatives.
Well, Ian, you're the politician here. I mean, are the conversations happening privately in political circles, but we're just not conscious of it in the wider world?
As the politician, I probably shouldn't answer that question, should answer something completely different. Certainly conversations are happening, Martina. However, I think there's an important thing we need to be cognizant of. Conversations only are successful if you have an open mind. If you have defined the destination, then you can't have an open conversation. And I think that's why probably many unionists wouldn't countenance the conversation. Why on earth would they? I think that most people, when we look at this...
The EU, no? To get back into the EU, as Andrea said?
Well, I think there'll be an interesting phenomenon happen. I think the longer we remain out of the EU, the less the appetite will be to return to the EU. And remember, I was a strong supporter of remaining because I always felt actually that Northern Ireland's position was best protected as part of the EU. I always felt that was the case. But I do think that the UK have a big economy. I think they have a strong enough economy and they probably can weather turbulent waters now and come through. That being said, I still think would be better as one trading bloc, but that's democracy. So as regards the conversation, I think that you know, when we look at the demographic of people who are under the age of 35 who didn't witness the troubles and didn't experience what many of us on the call this evening experienced, I think certainly there are people that are willing to have this conversation. The game changer is when anyone who's a supporter of Irish unity can say, well, okay, you will be wealthier, healthier and better off in United Ireland. And as we sit here tonight, that hasn't been demonstrated. And when unionists reconcile that with the current status quo, we're much better as part of the UK model, because actually it's a huge economy. It can support us. We have underlying issues. We have historic legacy issues. And certainly if we want to improve and make Northern Ireland a better place going forward, support that we get from Westminster is an important component of that. So I think that yeah, the conversations are happening, but I think that in the absence, look, for anyone who's a supporter of Irish unity, the game changer is when you present something that says, my children will be better off and healthier and wealthier. And then people say, well, can we join? How can we join? But at the moment, that certainly hasn't happened. I think it's probably not built on strong enough foundations, the argument. It's still around ideology. And I just think there needs to be more substance made to that argument. Because at the moment, I think we're better. We actually need to get better synergies east and west, north and south, because in that model, everybody wins.
Okay, Diarmaid, would you go along with that?
Well, it's reminded me of an interview I did years ago with Eamon McCann, and we were talking about a united Ireland, and he said, I wanted 32 county Ulster, because he was talking about what worked well in Ulster should well be applied to the rest of the country. But the point being, can we look at some bread and butter issues here? Now, we've got to consider what the political parties in the Republic are doing and saying about this.
Very little.
Yeah, well, this is the question. I mean, how much potential is there in this shared island initiative? And is that the way to go? And how much concrete detail is there in relation to working in different areas? Think back to when there was a thaw in the Cold War between North and South back in the late 50s and the early 1960s. They started to cooperate around non-contentious areas, so you look at waterways and you look at transport networks and so on, energy supply. You start with those things. You start with the practical economic infrastructural issues and so on. But when you begin to look for these plans, you don't really find them. I mean, Sinn Fein did come up, I think, in 2016 with a paper on unity, but it's very vague. There isn't much detail. We have to discuss this, or we'll have to discuss that. It doesn't drill down into it in too much detail. And Sinn Fein are also going to realize, I think, that it's not the burning question for many of the people who are voting for them. That yes, they can build a significant support on the back of discontent with an awful lot, including housing and health. But is unity the burning passion of the majority of those who are supporting Sinn Fein? I don't think so. So it's very early in the talk of unity and of border posts when you begin looking for what this means or will mean or could mean in practice in vital areas. And can I just say lastly, and because it's something that I've been saying about the experience of COVID on the island, when we were facing a threat on that scale, you couldn't even achieve all island cooperation in dealing with the pandemic. When it came to something as significant and important as that, Ireland is a single unit when it comes to animal health and animal disease, but not when it comes to human health and disease.
Yeah, I mean, it may not be the burning passion of Sinn Féin supporters, the idea of unity or a border poll, but it's certainly the burning passion of Sinn Féin politicians. So if they take office after the next general election in the Republic, a unity referendum will very much rocket up to the top of the pile.
I would just suggest that amongst those undecided voters in Northern Ireland, you might find that where, when they looked to the south around the time of the Brexit referendum and they saw Leo Varadkar as we've talked about before, people in Northern Ireland don't know very much. Indeed, they hardly know anything about domestic politics in the South. It's not something that's covered. But they saw somebody, and they saw a figurehead of a country that looked, increasingly liberal, and indeed
He marched in the Gay Pride Parade in Belfast.
But if Sinn Fein were in office, I wonder how many of those undecideds, and particularly people who come from traditionally a Protestant background, but may well think about rejoining the EU, I wonder how they would feel about voting to essentially join an Ireland that was run by Sinn Fein. And I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that it might look very different to undecided voters than it would voting for an Ireland that was run by by people that they considered to look just kind of very European and liberal and outward looking, and who didn't appear to be carrying that baggage. I think that there are undecided voters who might feel a little bit more uncomfortable. So while you're absolutely right that Sinn Fein being in office could rocket it to the top of the agenda, it may also make the likelihood of getting a border poll in Northern Ireland through slightly less likely.
Alex, do you want to come in there?
Yes, well, I think there are a number of points. I think the Sinn Fein have never really been fully tested in government, certainly in the South. And even in Northern Ireland, the peculiar nature of our executive, where it's almost like two governments in the one executive, at times they often appear like an opposition. And they don't really have to make decisions on tax. They don't have to. It's basically go to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who gives them, divvies up some money which they can spend. But they've never really had, and it applies to the DUP and other parties as well. Sinn Féin
it's highly unusual, isn't it? It's highly unusual to be in harness with a party that is in direct opposition to you. It's not that you've formed a coalition and agreed common policies.
Well, I think that's the difficult that they haven't done it here. And they haven't done it in the South yet. And when they get to that point, they will have to make decisions. And just on a much smaller scale, we saw it happen with the DUP. I remember the DUP in 1998, the Paisley ticket to United Ireland. Within 5 years, they were working it. They had built an entirely new relationship because the reality they had ceased to be. That changes, and when Sinn Féin is in opposition on both sides of the border, yes, they will emphasise the unity project, but it'll be much more difficult for them. And just very quickly on the point Ian made about the Scotland, if there's a Scottish referendum, it doesn't matter what the result is. Scotland is Scotland. If there's a border poll in Northern Ireland and the Unionists lose, then psychologically they lose their country, they lose their identity. And Ian is absolutely right about this. If they don't want to talk, and I have some sympathy for them not wanting to talk with people who propose a United Ireland and who say to them, get ready for it, it's coming, the demographics are against you. If they don't want to talk to them, at least have the common sense to talk to each other, because the conversations that need to be going on, they're not going on. They're not happening on the scale they need to be. And historically speaking, the biggest enemy of unionism has been unionism itself, because anyone who says, look, we need to talk about this, we need to face this, we need to accept this challenge, you are dismissed. We spend our whole time fighting each other. And even in the first Northern Ireland Assembly, we managed to start with 3 unionist parties in that assembly and ended up, I think, with 7. I mean, that's what we do. We divide. And anyone who wants to understand unionism, you need to talk. I've just finished it. There's a brilliant joke. David McNary used to, Ian will know him well, and Andrew probably does too. He was at one point David Trimble's chief of staff, a gatekeeper. And years ago, there was back in the 19, just after Sunningdale, they talked about bringing the DUP and UUP together, and a few others, the Orange, and to go for a Portrush hotel for a weekend to discuss the future of unionism. And David said, don't do that. Do not do that. And Jim Molyneux said, why not? And David said, you will go down with 3 unionist parties, the Orange Order, and a couple of fringe groups, and you'll come back on Sunday, and there'll be 7 unionist parties, 9 fringe groups, and 2 completely walking off the pitch altogether. And that's the problem. 50 years later, that is still the problem that bedeviled unionism, the inability. But forget about what Sinn Fein think, forget about republicanism, forget about what Michael Martin and Varadkar think, forget about all of that. Until unionists understand what they believe, what motivates them, what they actually want, talking to anyone else is absolutely pointless exercise.
Well, the split idea has happened and will continue to happen within republicanism as well. It's not just unionism. Look, unfortunately, we're out of time. That was such a fascinating conversation. Thank you to broadcaster Andrea Catherwood, historian Diarmaid Ferriter, political commentator Alex Kane, and politician Ian Marshall. Good luck to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Martina.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martina. Thank you.